The year was 1900, and the Australian outback stretched endlessly in every direction, a canvas of red earth, bleached bones, and dreams that shimmered like mirages in the afternoon heat. Hey, at the very edge of civilization, where the nearest neighbor lived 3 days' ride away, stood a weathered homestead that had witnessed more storms than most buildings in the cities ever would. Clara Whitfield had turned 53 that spring, though the harsh sun and relentless winds had carved lines into a face that spoke of wisdom rather than age. Her hands, callous from years of hauling water, mending fences, and tending to sick animals, still moved with a grace that betrayed the genteel upbringing she'd left behind in Melbourne decades ago. But it was her eyes, deep brown like the richest soil after rain, that held the most compelling story. They carried the weight of words never spoken, letters never sent, and a love that had endured despite 20 years of silence. Each morning, Clara would rise before dawn and walk to a small wooden desk positioned by the single window that faced east. There, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, she would take out a piece of paper, precious commodity in these remote parts, and begin to write. The letters always started the same way. My dearest Philip. What followed were the intimate thoughts of a woman who had learned to find companionship in solitude, strength in silence, and hope in the endless expanse of sky that connected her to wherever he might be. She never posted these letters. How could she, when she didn't even know if he was alive? Instead, they filled a cedar box beneath her bed, hundreds of them now, each one a conversation with a ghost, a prayer whispered to the wind, a testament to a love that refused to die despite the passage of time. Clara had built a life of quiet purpose in this harsh landscape. She raised sheep, grew vegetables in soil that fought her every step of the way, and traded wool and preserves with the occasional travelers who passed through seeking supplies or shelter. She had learned to read the moods of the weather, to coax water from reluctant wells, and to find beauty in the stark majesty of her surroundings. Yet despite all her self-sufficiency, despite all the peace she had cultivated in solitude, there remained an ache in her chest, a space shaped exactly like the man who had ridden away in 1878 and never looked back. Until today. It was mid-afternoon when she first saw the speck on the horizon. At first, Clara dismissed it as another of the Outback's countless illusions. A bird, a dust devil, perhaps a wayward bush tumbling across the plain. But as she shaded her eyes with her hand and squinted into the distance, the speck took on definition. A rider, moving steadily toward her homestead with the purposeful gait of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Visitors were rare enough to make Clara's heart quicken, but there was something about the way this rider sat in the saddle, straight back but relaxed, confident yet unhurried, that made her breath catch in her throat. 22 years was a long time, long enough for memory to play tricks and hope to cloud judgment. But as the figure drew closer, Clara felt a trembling in her hands that she hadn't experienced since she was a young woman. The rider was perhaps half a mile away now, close enough for Clara to see that he wore a dark hat and a coat despite the heat, close enough to notice the gray-muzzled horse beneath him, a sturdy animal built for long distances rather than speed. Close enough for Clara to see what her heart had already recognized. Philip Morrison had come home. He was 55 now. She calculated quickly, his dark hair surely streaked with silver beneath her hat, his face weathered by whatever roads had carried him through more than 2 decades of absence. But even from this distance, even through the wavering heat, she knew the set of his shoulders, the way he held his head, the steady rhythm of his approach. Clara stood frozen on a porch, one hand gripping the wooden railing so tightly her knuckles went white. Part of her wanted to run inside, to pretend she hadn't seen him, to protect herself from whatever pain his arrival might bring. Another part wanted to run toward him, to close the distance between them as quickly as possible. Instead, she did what she had learned to do best over the years. She waited, drawing strength from stillness, preparing herself for whatever conversation was about to unfold. As Philip drew nearer, Clara could see that time had indeed marked him. His shoulders, though still proud, carried the weight of years and experiences she couldn't imagine. But there was something in the way he rode, something in his deliberate approach, that suggested this was not a casual visit or coincidence. This was a man who had traveled a great distance with a specific purpose. The sound of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth grew louder, and with it, Clara felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crack. She had written 1,000 letters to this man, poured her soul onto paper night after night, but she had never truly believed she would see him again. Now, as he approached the last 100 yards of the gate, she realized that all those letters had been practiced for this moment, this opportunity to finally say the words she had been writing in the darkness for 22 years. Philip reined in his horse at the gate, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the space of a front yard. The afternoon sun caught the silver in his hay, and Clara could see new lines around his eyes, lines that spoke of laughter and sorrow, of distances traveled and decisions that couldn't be undone. But his eyes, those startling blue eyes that had haunted her dreams, were exactly as she remembered them. "Clara," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered but carrying the same gentle cadence that had once read poetry to her beneath the stars. "I hope I'm not intruding." The formality of his words contrasted sharply with the intimacy of the moment, and Clara found herself caught between laughter and tears. After 22 years of silence, after hundreds of unsent letters, after countless nights wondering if he was dead or alive, Philip Morrison was concerned about intruding. "Philip," she managed, her voice steadier than she had expected. "You're not intruding. You never could." He dismounted then, moving with the careful precision of a man who had spent too many years in the saddle. As he tied his horse to a fence post, Clara noticed the way he favored his left leg slightly, and her heart ached with questions she didn't yet dare ask. What had these years done to him? Where had he been? And most importantly, why had he come back now? But those questions could wait. For now, it was enough that he was here, real and solid and close enough that she could see the way the sun had weathered his hands, the way his coat had been carefully mended in several places, the way he looked at her homestead with eyes that took in every detail, the garden she had coaxed from unwilling soil, the repairs she had made to the roof, the wind chime she had fashioned from bits of metal and glass that caught the afternoon light and cast dancing reflections across the porch. "You've made a good life here," Philip said, genuine admiration in his voice. "I always knew you would." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. He had known she would make a good life, which many had thought of her, had wondered about her, had perhaps even worried about her welfare during their years apart. The knowledge was both comforting and painful, a reminder of all the time they had lost. "Would you like some tea?" Clara asked, falling back on the social graces that had carried her through countless difficult moments over the years. "You must be tired from your journey." "That would be kind," Philip replied, and Clara detected a note of relief in his voice, as if he had been preparing himself for rejection and was grateful for any sign of welcome. As she led him up the steps and across the threshold of her home, Clara was acutely aware of how her life would look to his eyes. The furniture was simple but well-maintained, the floors clean-swept, the windows clear. Books lined one wall, novels and poetry, practical guides to farming and animal husbandry, and a worn collection of Shakespeare that she read aloud to herself on quiet evenings. Fresh wildflowers set in a jar on the table, and the kitchen garden was visible through the back window, green and thriving despite the challenging climate. But it was a small desk by the front window that drew Clara's attention as they entered. On it lay her morning's work, a half-finished letter that began, as they all did, with "My dearest Philip." She moved quickly to fold it and put it away, but not before she caught Philip's eyes following her movement, noting the paper, the pen, the way she protected whatever she had been writing. "I'll put the kettle on," Clara said, needing something to do with her hands, some mundane task to anchor her to reality while her mind reeled with the impossibility of his presence. As she moved around her kitchen, measuring tea leaves and setting out her best cups, Clara was aware of Philip standing in her main room, looking around with the careful attention of someone trying to understand how she had spent the years of their separation. She could feel his presence like a physical thing, a warmth and weight that filled spaces in her heart she hadn't realized were still empty. The kettle whistled, and Clara prepared the tea with hands that trembled only slightly. When she returned to the main room with the tray, she found Philip standing near her bookshelf, looking at a photograph she had forgotten was there, a daguerreotype of herself at 30, taken just a few months before he had ridden away. "You kept this," he said softly, not quite a question. "I kept many things," Clara replied, setting the tea tray down on her small table. "The heart doesn't let go easily." They sat then, in chairs positioned near the window where Clara spent her mornings writing, and for several minutes they simply drank their tea in comfortable silence. Outside, the afternoon was beginning to fade toward evening, painting the sky in deeper shades of gold and orange. The familiar sounds of a daily life continued around them, the bleating of sheep, the rustle of wind through the scrub grass, the distant call of a kookaburra preparing for night. "I've thought of this place often," Philip said eventually. "Of you, of the life you were building here when I—" He paused, searching for words. "When I made the choice to leave." Clara felt her chest tighten. They were approaching dangerous territory now, the landscape of old wounds and unanswered questions that had shaped so many of her unsent letters. "I never understood why," she said quietly. "One day you were here, helping me repair the roof, talking about expanding the sheep run. The next day you were gone, with nothing but a note saying you had to leave and couldn't explain why." Philip's hands tightened around his teacup, and Clara saw pain flicker across his features. "I thought it was for the best. I thought—" He stopped, shook his head. "I was wrong about many things." The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and precious as spun glass. Clara felt 22 years of hurt and confusion begin to shift, making room for something she hadn't dared hope for: understanding, perhaps even forgiveness. "Why now?" she asked. "Why have you come back now?" Philip set down his teacup and looked directly at her, and Clara saw in his eyes the same vulnerability she remembered from their youth, the same capacity for deep feeling that had drawn her to him in the first place. "Because I'm tired of running," he said simply. "Because I'm tired of believing I don't deserve happiness. And because every road I've traveled, every place I've tried to call home, has led me back to thoughts of you." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her heart race. This was what she had written about in hundreds of letters, the confession she had imagined in countless lonely evenings. But hearing it spoken aloud, seeing the truth of it in his eyes, was more overwhelming than she had ever anticipated. If stories of long-lost love, second chances, and life in the remote corners of Australia touch your heart, consider subscribing and leaving a like to help us bring more of these unforgettable voices back to life. And let us know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? These tales of resilience and romance continue to unfold in the endless expanses where the human heart reveals its deepest truths. Chapter 1. The Letters She Never Sent. The cedar box beneath Clara's bed held more than letters. It contained the archaeology of a love that had refused to die. Each piece of paper represented a day when missing Philip had felt unbearable, a night when the silence of the Outback had seemed too vast to feel alone, a moment when something beautiful or terrible had happened, and her first instinct had been to share it with him. The earliest letters, written just weeks after his departure in 1878, were desperate things, full of questions, pleas for explanation, promises that whatever had driven him away could be overcome if only he would return. Clara remembered writing them in a fever of grief and hope, believing that somehow the act of putting her feelings into words would summon him back across whatever distance separated them. "My dearest Philip," one of these early letters began, "the sheep miss you. Yesterday I found them gathered near the gate where you used to stand in the evenings, as if they too were watching the horizon for your return. I miss you in ways I cannot name. In the silence where your laughter used to live, in the empty space at the breakfast table, in the countless small tasks that were made bearable by your presence. Please, if you read this, know that whatever drove you away need not keep you away. Love finds solutions where fear sees only problems." She had walked to the nearest settlement, a brutal 2-day journey on horseback, to post that letter, only to stand at the mail depot paralyzed by the realization that she had no address to send it to. Philip had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed him, leaving no trace of where he might have gone or what name he might be using. The ride home had been the longest of Clara's life, the unposted letter burning like an accusation in her stool bag. That night, she had placed it in the cedar box her grandmother had given her for storing precious things, never imagining it would become a repository for one-sided conversations with a ghost. As months turned to years, the letters changed. The desperate pleas gave way to daily observations, shared thoughts, the kind of intimate communication that married couples might exchange across a breakfast table. Clara wrote to Philip about the changing seasons, the way the first rains brought wildflowers blooming across the red earth in impossible profusion. She told him about the challenges, the year the well went dry and she had to haul water from a spring 5 miles away, the season when dingoes took half her sheep, and she spent sleepless nights patrolling with her rifle, the day she fell from the roof while making repairs and lay unconscious for hours before a passing traveler found her. My dearest Philip, she wrote during that difficult time, if I had died today, alone under the vast sky with both love, I think I would have been content knowing that somewhere in this world, you carry the memory of our time together. Love doesn't require presence of Indio. It lives in the way we've learned to see beauty, in the strength we've developed to face hardship, in the kindness we show to strangers because someone once showed such kindness to us. You may be gone, but you are not lost to me. You are woven into the fabric of how I move through the world. The middle years brought letters of growing confidence and hard-won wisdom. Clara wrote about the successes. The year her wool brought premium prices in Adelaide, the day she successfully delivered twin lambs from a ewe everyone said wouldn't survive, the evening she watched the perfect sunset and felt, for the first time since his departure, complete joy unmingled with grief. She wrote about the people who passed through her life, the young couple heading west with nothing but hope and determination, whom she fed and sheltered for 3 days while their wagon was being repaired. The Aboriginal stockman who taught her to read the signs of drought in the behavior of birds and the color of certain flowers. The elderly woman traveling to visit grandchildren she hadn't seen in a decade, who spent an evening sharing stories of lost loves and found purposes. My dearest Philip, Clara wrote out for the elderly woman's visit. She told me that love is not about possession but about blessing, that to truly love someone is to want their highest good even when it doesn't include you. I'm trying to learn this lesson, to love you not with the grasping hands of need but with the open palms of benediction. If your highest good required leaving me, then I choose to honor that choice, even as my heart breaks with the honoring. Perhaps this is what maturity brings. The ability to love without demanding, to hope without expecting, to remember without bitterness. The later letters reflected a woman who had learned to find herself complete in solitude while remaining open to the possibility of companionship. Clara wrote about her expanding garden, her experiments with different crops, her growing reputation among the scattered settlements as someone who could be trusted with secrets, who could offer practical help without judgment, who could make even the roughest travelers feel welcomed and seen. She wrote about the books she read, how Dickens made her laugh aloud in her empty house, how Keats could move her to tears with his understanding of beauty and mortality, how the practical guides of agriculture felt like conversations with mentors she had never met but had come to trust implicitly. My dearest Philip, she wrote on her 50th birthday, today I am 50 years old, and I feel like I'm just beginning to understand who I am when I'm not defined by who I am missing. The woman who writes to you now is not the same one you left 22 years ago. She has been shaped by solitude into something I think you would recognize, but also something that might surprise you. She has learned that strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the willingness to be vulnerable for worthy purposes. She has learned that home is not a place you find, but a condition you create, day by day, choice by choice, act of love by act of love. The most recent letters had taken on a quality of peaceful acceptance. Clara no longer wrote with the urgency of someone waiting for rescue or the bitterness of someone nursing wounds. Instead, she wrote as someone who had made a full life from partial materials, who had learned to be grateful for what was while still honoring what had been lost. My dearest Philip, began the letter she had been writing that very morning. The seasons tone, and with each one I'm reminded that time is not the enemy of love but its great teacher. What we had together was real and precious, not diminished by its brevity or complicated by its ending. I have learned to carry you not as a burden of grief but as a treasure of memory, not as a wound that won't heal but as a scar that tells the story of my capacity to love deeply. If we never meet again in this life, know that you have already given me the greatest gift, the knowledge that I am capable of love that transcends time and distance and even understanding. Each letter was dated, each one carefully folded and placed in the cedar box in chronological order. Together, they formed a document of extraordinary emotional archaeology, charting the evolution of a woman's heart from desperate longing through mature acceptance to a kind of peaceful transcendence that neither denied the pain of loss nor surrendered to its dominance. Clara had never intended for anyone else to read these letters, but she had also never stopped hoping that somehow, someday, The man they were written to might appear, and she would finally have the opportunity to bridge a gap between the written word and spoken truth. They were her practice for a conversation she never believed would happen, her preparation for a reunion she had trained herself not to expect. What Clara hadn't anticipated was how the discipline of writing these letters would shape her into exactly the kind of woman capable of handling such a reunion with grace. The daily practice of examining her feelings, of finding words to complex emotions, of maintaining hope without bitterness and love without possessiveness had been its own form of spiritual exercise. She had been preparing for Philip's return without knowing she was doing so, strengthening the very qualities that will be required to navigate the delicate territory of renewed connection with someone who had once known her intimately but had missed the decades of her transformation. The letters had taught her patience and perspective, but they had also kept alive the flame of hope that burns at the center of all great love. The belief that some connections are too essential to be severed by time or distance, that some loves are too authentic to be dismissed as merely the romanticized memories of youth. In maintaining her connection to Philip through the written word, Clara had maintained her faith in the possibility that love, real love, finds a way to complete itself even across vast expanses of time and geography. Now, as evening shadows began to lengthen across her homestead and the man himself sat in a main room drinking tea from her best china, Clara realized that every letter in that cedar box had been leading to this moment. This opportunity to discover whether the love she had preserved in writing could translate into the messy, complicated, ultimately beautiful reality of two people choosing each other again after decades of separation. The letters had been her way of keeping faith with a future she could barely imagine. Now that future sat across from her, weathered and changed but unmistakably present, asking her to translate 22 years of written love into the courage required for a second chance at happiness. Chapter 2. A Rider in the Dust. The first thing Clara noticed about Philip in the fading afternoon light was how he had learned to inhabit silence. The young man she remembered had been quick to fill quiet moments with observations about the weather, plans for improving the land, or readings from whatever book had captured his attention. This older Philip sat comfortable in the spaces between words, his presence steady and unhurried in a way that spoke of years spent in contemplation. As they finished their tea, Clara found herself studying the changes time had wrought in the man who had once been as familiar to her as her own reflection. His hair, still thick but now silver-threaded, caught the lamplight she lit as darkness approached. New lines bracketed his eyes, lines that could have been carved by laughter or sorrow, she couldn't yet tell which. His hands, wrapped around the delicate teacup, bore scars and calluses that told stories she didn't yet know, mapping decades of labor and hardship she could only imagine. But it was his eyes that held her attention most completely. They carried a depth that hadn't been there in his youth, a gravity that suggested he had seen things that changed a man permanently. Yet when he looked at her, she caught glimpses of the person she had fallen in love with, the curiosity, the gentleness, the intelligence that had first drawn her to him all those years ago. "I should see to my horse," Philip said as full darkness settled around them. "If you don't mind, I'd like to camp nearby tonight. I don't want to impose on your hospitality by assuming I'm welcome to stay inside." The formality of his request broke Clara's heart a little. After 22 years of writing to him as the most intimate of confidants, having him ask permission to camp on a property felt like evidence of how much ground they would need to recover before they could find their way back to each other. "There's a lean-to behind the house where travelers usually stay," Clara offered. "It's got a good roof and sides to break the wind. You're welcome to it for as long as you need." "Thank you," Philip replied, genuine gratitude in his voice. "I know my arrival must be complicated for you. I'm grateful for any kindness you can spare." Complicated was an understatement that almost made Clara laugh, except she was afraid that if she started laughing she might not be able to stop, or worse, might start crying instead. She had dreamed of his return countless times, but in her dreams the complications had always seemed manageable, the emotions clear-cut. The reality was messier, more overwhelming, shot through with currents of joy and grief and fear and hope that threatened to sweep away her carefully constructed equilibrium. "I'll walk out with you," Clara said, reaching for a lantern. "Make sure you have everything you need." The night air was crisp and clean, filled with the familiar sounds of a small world, the soft bleating of sheep settling for sleep, the rustle of night-hunting creatures moving through the scrub grass, the whisper of wind through the ghost gums that provided her homestead's only shade. Walking beside Philip toward the Linta, Clara was acutely aware of his physical presence in a way that made her feel like a young woman again. The breadth of his shoulders, the rhythm of his stride, the way he automatically positioned himself between her and any potential hazard. All these details registered with intensity that reminded her how long it had been since she had shared a space with another human being. The Linta was simple but well-maintained, with a raised platform for sleeping that would keep him off the ground and hooks for hanging gear. Clara had built it herself in the early years, anticipating that travelers might need shelter, and that the extra income from occasional guests would help sustain her through difficult seasons. It had served her well over the years, providing temporary home to dozens of people passing through a remote corner of the world. "This will do perfectly," Philip said, examining the structure with the practiced eye of someone who had spent many nights in far less comfortable accommodations. "You built this?" "Years ago," Clara replied. "I've learned to do most things for myself out here." Something in her tone must have conveyed the weight of those years, because Philip stopped what he was doing and looked at her directly. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for leaving you to face all this alone, for not finding a way to explain, for staying away so long that sorry feels inadequate." The words hit Clara like a physical impact, so unexpected and direct that she had to grip the doorframe to steady herself. This was what she had imagined him saying in 1,000 different scenarios, but she hadn't been prepared for how it would feel to actually hear it. The relief and pain and possibility all tangled together in her chest. "We'll have time to talk about all that," she managed. "For now, just rest. You must be exhausted from traveling." Philip nodded, but he didn't break eye contact. "Clara," he said, her name softened his mouth like a prayer. "I want you to know, coming here, seeing you again, it's not something I did lightly. I don't have any right to your forgiveness or your friendship, but I hope we can find a way forward that honors what we once meant to each other." The careful formality of his words told Clara that Philip understood exactly how delicate the situation was, how much potential for hurt still existed between them. His approach was that of a man who had learned hard lessons about the consequences of careless choices, who would rather err on the side of caution than cause additional pain. "Sleep well," Clara said, not trusting herself to say more without revealing the storm of emotions his presence had unleashed in her heart. "I'll have breakfast ready at sunrise if you'd like to join me." "I'd like that very much," Philip replied, and for just a moment his careful composure slipped enough to reveal the longing underneath. Clara walked back to her house alone, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the ground ahead of her. Once inside, she moved through the familiar routines of evening, banking the fire, checking the locks, preparing for sleep, but her mind was entirely occupied with the impossibility of Philip's presence just 50 yards away. She had imagined this scenario so many times over the years, but she had never anticipated how unsettling it would be to have him so close yet still separated by so much unspoken history. The physical proximity made her hyper-aware of everything. The way the wind sounded different when she knew someone else was listening to it. The way her small house felt both more precious and more lonely when viewed through the eyes of someone who was seeing it for the first time. Unable to settle, Clara found herself drawn to the cedar box beneath her bed. She pulled it out and sat on her bedroom floor, surrounded by 22 years of one-sided correspondence. In the lamplight, the letters seemed to pulse with their own life, each one a messenger she had prepared but never sent, carrying words she had written but never spoken. Almost without conscious decision, she found herself reaching for one of the more recent letters, unfolding it and reading her own words as if they had been written by someone else. "My dearest Philip, today I watched a storm build on the horizon and thought of you, as I so often do when the sky turns dramatic. The way the clouds gathered and darkened reminded me of your eyes when you were thinking deeply about something, the way they would grow intense and distant as if you were seeing something beyond the immediate moment. I wondered, as I have wondered so many times, what storms have crossed your horizon in these years of our separation. Have you found shelter when you needed it? Have you found reasons to hope when the darkness gathered? Have you learned, as I have learned, that love doesn't diminish with distance, but rather distills itself into something purer, more essential, more capable of surviving whatever weather comes?" The words seemed to shimmer on the page, taking on new meaning now that Philip was actually here, now that her hypothetical audience had become flesh and blood breathing the same night air just beyond her walls. Clara felt a strange doubling of consciousness. She was simultaneously the woman who had written these letters in solitude and the woman who might soon share them with their intended recipient. A soft sound from outside made her freeze, her heart suddenly pounding. Footsteps, moving slowly around her house. For a moment, fear flickered through her. 22 years of living alone had taught her to be cautious about unexpected sounds in the darkness. But then she recognized a measured pace, the careful way the footsteps avoided the areas where the ground was most uneven. Philip was walking the perimeter of a property, taking the measure of the life she had built in his absence. Clara rose quietly and moved to her front window, peering through the curtains without lighting a lamp. In the moonlight, she could see Philip's figure moving slowly past a garden, pausing to examine the way she had laid out the rows, the ingenious system of channels and barriers she had developed to make the most of every precious drop of rain. He stopped at a sheep pen, and she watched him lean against the fence, looking out at the animals that represented her primary livelihood and source of companionship during the long, quiet years. There was something achingly familiar about his posture, the way he rested his forearms on the top rail and let his weight settle into the fence. She had seen him stand exactly like that countless times during their brief time together, usually when he was thinking through some complex problem or simply enjoying the peace of evening settling over the land. The sight broke something open in Clara's chest, a recognition so profound it left her breathless. This was not a stranger exploring her property out of idle curiosity. This was Philip, taking inventory of the life she had made, trying to understand how she had spent the decades of their separation. He was reading her homestead like a letter she had written to him in timber and stone and living things, deciphering the story of her choices, her struggles, her small victories and quiet defeats. When he finally returned to the lean-to, Clara remained at the window for a long time, watching the small glow of his lamp through the gaps in the wall. The reality of his presence seemed both miraculous and terrible. Miraculous because she had dreamed of this moment for over 2 decades. Terrible because she had no idea what would come next. Tomorrow they would have to begin the delicate process of discovering whether the love they had shared as young people could survive the weight of all the years between then and now. Clara returned to her letters, but instead of reading them, she found herself imagining what it would be like to share them with Philip. Would he recognize the woman who had written them as the same one he had once loved? Would he be able to see how her feelings had evolved and deepened, how her love for him had matured from the passionate attachment of youth into something more complex and enduring? Most frightening of all, would he want to? Or had he returned only to satisfy curiosity, to tie up loose ends, to prove to himself that what they had shared was just a youthful infatuation that couldn't survive the test of real time and distance? As Clara finally prepared for bed, she realized that tomorrow would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed. The letters had been safe because they demanded nothing of her except honesty with herself. But having Philip here, real and present and available for actual conversation, meant risking everything she had built her life around. It meant being willing to discover that some loves are better preserved in memory than resurrected in reality. Yet as she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the night sounds that had been a lullaby for so many years, Clara felt beneath her fear a deep current of something that might have been joy. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever pain or awkwardness or disappointment might follow, tonight Philip Morrison was sleeping 50 yards from her house after 22 years of absence. Tonight, for the first time in more than 2 decades, she was not alone under the vast Australian sky. It was enough. It had to be enough. And it was more than she had allowed herself to hope for in longer than she could remember. Chapter 3. Memories in the Wind. Dawn came slowly to the Outback, painting the eastern sky in watercolors of rose and gold before the sun finally crested the horizon and sent long shadows racing across the red earth. Clara had been awake for an hour already, standing at a kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching the lean-to for any sign that Philip was stirring. She had barely slept, her mind too full of questions and possibilities to find rest. Every time she had begun to drift off, some small sound from outside, the creak of settling wood, the shuffle of his horse moving in the makeshift corral, had jolted her back to the stunning reality of his presence. 22 years of solitude had made her hyper-aware of any change in her environment, and the addition of another human being to her small world felt as momentous as an earthquake. When she finally saw smoke beginning to rise from the lean-to small chimney, Clara's heart began to race with nervous anticipation. She had promised him breakfast, which gave her something concrete to focus on, but beneath the familiar routine of cooking lay the enormous question of what they would say to each other in the harsh light of morning. The previous evening had been cushioned by shock and the natural rhythms of hospitality, but today they would have to begin the real work of discovering who they had become during their years apart. Clara prepared a meal that was generous without being ostentatious. Fresh eggs from her chickens, bread she had baked the day before, preserves made from the wild berries that grew near the spring, and coffee that she had been saving for special occasions. As she worked, she found herself remembering other mornings when she had cooked for Philip, the easy domesticity they had shared during their brief time together. He had always been an early riser, she recalled, someone who liked to greet the day with purpose and energy. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie. When she opened it, she found Philip standing on a porch, hat in hand, his silver hair neatly combed and his clothes freshly brushed despite their obvious age and wear. The morning light revealed new details about how the years had changed him. The deeper lines around his eyes, the way his left shoulder sat slightly higher than his right, the careful way he held himself that suggested old injuries imperfectly healed. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm but cautious. "Something smells wonderful." "Good morning," Clara replied, stepping aside to let him enter. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Philip admitted, and something in his tone suggested this was more significant than casual politeness. "It's been a long time since I've had a real roof over my head." The comment raised a dozen questions in Clara's mind, but she filed them away for later. This morning required gentleness, patience, the gradual building of comfort between two people who had once known each other intimately but were now nearly strangers. Over breakfast, they spoke carefully of neutral things, the quality of the season, the condition of Clara's livestock, the challenges of maintaining a homestead so far from civilization. But beneath the surface conversation, Clara was acutely aware of everything about Philip that was different from her memories. The way he ate with economical movements that suggested years of uncertain meals. The way his eyes constantly tracked to the windows, monitoring the horizon with the vigilance of someone accustomed to potential danger. The way he held himself ready to leave at a moment's notice, even while sitting at a kitchen table sharing a peaceful meal. "You've done remarkable work here," Philip said, gesturing toward the window that revealed a garden and the neat arrangement of outbuildings she had constructed over the years. "This is more than survival. This is a real homestead." "It's taken time," Clara replied. "In the early years, I wasn't sure I could manage alone. There were seasons when I thought I might have to sell and move back to town. But you didn't." "No, I didn't." Clara met his eyes across the table. "Something in me refused to give up on this place, on the life I was trying to build here, on the hope that you might return." She didn't add, but the words hung in the air between them anyway. After breakfast, Philip insisted on helping with the morning chores, and Clara found herself leading him through the routines that had shaped her days for over 2 decades. They worked mostly in companionable silence, but Clara was intensely aware of how naturally Philip fell into the rhythms of her life. When she went to feed the chickens, he automatically checked the water containers and examined the fence for damage. When she moved hay for the sheep, he noticed which animals seemed less healthy and pointed them out quietly for her attention. "You remember," Clara observed as they finished securing the sheep pen, "how to read the signs. I mean, how to see what needs doing." "Some things you don't forget," Philip replied. "Besides, this is good land. It wants to be productive. You just have to listen to what it needs." They walked together to the well that provided Clara's water, and she showed him the improvements she had made over the years. The windmill she had installed to make pumping easier, the cistern system that collected and stored rainwater, the elaborate network of channels that distributed water efficiently to her garden and livestock areas. "Ingenious," Philip said, genuinely impressed. "This must have taken years to plan and build." "I had plenty of time," Clara said with a slight smile, "and plenty of motivation. Water is life out here. Everything else depends on getting that right." As they worked, Clara began to relax into Philip's presence, remembering how well they had always functioned as a team. There was an ease between them that transcended the awkwardness of reunion, a compatibility that seemed to have survived intact despite everything that had happened. But it was when they were walking back from checking the fence line that Philip finally broached the subject they had been carefully avoiding. "Clara," he said, stopping in the shadow of a ghost gum that provided the only shade for miles. "I need to tell you why I left. Why I stayed away so long. You deserve to understand." Clara's heart began to pound, but she nodded. "I'm listening." Philip was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon as if he could see the past written there in heat shimmer and distant mountains. "Do you remember James Crawford?" he asked finally. Clara searched her memory. "The magistrate's son? The one who was always causing trouble in town." "That's him." Philip's voice was flat, carefully controlled. "The night before I left, he came to see me. He was drunk, angry about some slight he imagined I had done him. We fought, not just words, but fists. I was younger then, quicker to anger. I hit him harder than I meant to." Clara waited, sensing there was more. "He fell," Philip continued, "hit his head on the edge of a trough. For a moment, I thought I had killed him." The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that Clara was only beginning to understand. "But you hadn't," she said quietly. "He recovered." "Eventually, yes, but not before his father had sworn out a warrant for my arrest. Not before he had made it clear that if I stayed in the district, I would hang for attempted murder regardless of what actually happened." Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she began to understand the magnitude of what Philip was telling her. "So you ran." "I ran," Philip confirmed. "I thought it would be temporary, that I could lie low for a few months, maybe a year, until tempers cooled and reason prevailed. I left you that note because I couldn't bear to tell you the truth, couldn't bear to have you think of me as a man who had nearly killed someone in a drunken brawl." "But it wasn't a year," Clara said softly. "No, it wasn't. Crawford's father had more influence than I realized, more reach. Every time I tried to come back, every time I got close to home, word would find me that the warrant was still active, that he was still determined to see me hang for what happened to his son." Philip turned to look at Clara directly, and she saw in his eyes the accumulated pain of 22 years of exile. "I tried to write to you," he said. "Dozens of times, hundreds of times. But what could I say? That I was a fugitive? That I might never be able to come home? That loving me had put you at risk too, because anyone who helped me will be considered an accomplice." Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes as she began to comprehend the full scope of what Philip had endured, the impossible choice he had been forced to make. "So you stayed away," she whispered. "I stayed away. I worked under other names, in other places. I lived like a ghost, always moving, never putting down roots, never allowing myself to care about anyone or anything because caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant capture." They stood in silence for several minutes, the weight of revelation settling between them like dust after a storm. Clara was trying to reconcile this story with the letters she had written, with the years of wondering and waiting and slowly building resentment. All this time, she had imagined scenarios where Philip had chosen to leave her, where his absence was a rejection or abandonment. She had never imagined that he had been torn away by forces beyond his control, that his silence had been protection rather than indifference. "What changed?" she asked finally. "Why are you here now?" Philip's smile was sad and tired. "Crawford died last year. Cancer. His father followed him 3 months later. Old age and grief. With both of them gone, I finally had a lawyer look into the warrant. Turns out it had been withdrawn years ago, when Crawford recovered fully and his father realized that prosecuting me might bring uncomfortable attention to his son's drinking and gambling debts." Clara stared at him, feeling the full irony of the situation crash over her like a wave. "You mean you could have come home years ago?" "Apparently so. But I was so used to running, so convinced that returning meant certain death, that I never thought to check. I lived as a fugitive for 15 years after the danger had passed. The knowledge was almost too much to bear. 15 years of unnecessary separation, 15 years of letters that could have been conversations. 15 years of lonely nights that could have been shared mornings. I'm sorry, Philip said quietly. I know sorry isn't enough. Can't begin to be enough. I know I took your choices away from you. Made decisions about your life without asking what you wanted. I know I hurt you in ways that may be impossible to forgive. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the silver hay, the weathered hands, the careful way he held himself like a man who had learned not to trust in the permanence of anything good. She thought of the cedar box full of letters, of the night she had spent wondering if he was alive or dead, of the slow process by which he had learned to build a complete life around an incomplete heart. I wrote to you, she said suddenly, every day, for 22 years. I wrote you letters I never sent. Philip's eyes widened. Letters? Hundreds of them. Thousands. Maybe. They're in a cedar box under my bed. Every thought I wanted to share with you. Every question I wanted to ask. Every story I wanted to tell. A lifetime of conversations with a ghost. Something profound shifted in Philip's expression. A recognition of the depth of a devotion and the magnitude of what they had both lost. Could I? He hesitated. Would you let me read them? Clara felt her chest tighten with vulnerability and possibility. Those letters contained her most private thoughts, her deepest emotions, the record of how she had grown and changed in his absence. Sharing them would be like offering him a map to her soul. Yes, she said simply. I think I wrote them so you could read them someday. They walked back to the house in silence, each lost in the implications of what had been revealed. At the threshold, Clara paused. Philip, she said, all those years when you thought you couldn't come home, did you ever love anyone else? He turned to face her, and Clara saw in his eyes the same question she had been afraid to ask herself. No, he said quietly. I told myself I was protecting other people from the danger of association with me, but the truth is, I never stopped loving you. Even when I thought I would never see you again, even when I tried to convince myself you had forgotten me and moved on to a better life, you were always there in my heart. No other woman ever had a chance against the memory of what was shared. The admission hung between them, fragile and precious as spun glass. Clara felt 22 years of carefully maintained composure beginning to crack, revealing the young woman who had never stopped hoping for exactly these words. Come inside, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Let me show you those letters. As they crossed the threshold together, Clara realized that this was a moment everything would change. For 22 years, she had been the sole author of their love story, writing both sides of a conversation that existed only in her imagination. Now, finally, Philip would be able to respond. The monologue was about to become a dialogue. Whether the dialogue would lead to healing or heartbreak remained to be seen, but Clara knew with certainty that she was ready to find out. Some conversations were worth 22 years of waiting. The cedar box sat on a kitchen table between them like an altar, containing the archaeology of devotion that had sustained Clara through more than 2 decades of solitude. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid, revealing layers of carefully folded papers arranged in chronological order from the desperate early letters to the mature reflections of recent years. There are so many, Philip said softly, his voice filled with wonder and something that might have been guilt. One for almost every day you were gone, Clara confirmed. Sometimes more when something significant happened, or when missing you felt too heavy to bear alone. She reached for one of the middle letters, from perhaps 10 years ago, when she had begun to find her stride as an independent woman, but still carried the ache of his absence. Would you? She hesitated, then forced herself to continue. Would you read one aloud? I've never heard these words spoken except in my own voice. Philip's hands were gentle as he unfolded the letter she had chosen, and Clara held her breath as he began to read in his deep, familiar voice. My dearest Philip, today I delivered a foal in a storm that threatened to take the roof off the barn. As I knelt in the straw, helping new life enter the world while the wind howled like all the fury of heaven, I thought of you and wondered if somewhere you too were sheltering from the same storm, if somewhere you too were witnessing the everyday miracles that make all the hardship worthwhile. The foal was perfect. Legs like polished timber, eyes bright with curiosity about this strange new world. As I watched him struggle to his feet and take his first tentative steps, I was reminded that courage is not the absence of uncertainty, but the willingness to move forward despite it. I hope, wherever you are, that you are still finding reasons to take tentative steps toward whatever light you can see, even in the darkest storms. Philip's voice caught on the final words, and Clara saw tears gathering in his eyes. The letter, which had been written as a message to an absent beloved, took on entirely new meaning when spoken aloud in his actual presence. "You were thinking of me," he said quietly. "All those years, you were still thinking of me." "Every day," Clara confirmed. "In small things and large ones, in moments of joy and seasons of struggle. You were woven into the fabric of how I experience the world." They spent the afternoon sharing letters, with Philip reading some aloud and Clara telling him the stories behind others. Gradually, through this exchange of written memory and spoken context, they began to bridge the gap between who they had been and who they had become. Philip read letters that chronicled Clara's growth from a dependent young woman to a capable homesteader. Clara explained the practical challenges behind the philosophical reflections he was reading, the way abstract thoughts about love and loss had been forged in the concrete realities of drought, disease, isolation, and the daily small victories that had built her current life. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they sat together on Clara's porch with a box of letters between them, watching the familiar beauty of evenings settling over the land they both loved. "I have something for you too," Philip said quietly, reaching into his coat pocket. He withdrew a small, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with his careful handwriting. "I may not have been able to send them, but I wrote to you as well. Not every day, but often enough." Clara accepted the journal with hands that shook slightly, understanding that this was Philip's equivalent of a cedar box, his record of longing, his way of maintaining connection across the void of separation. She opened it at random and found herself reading an entry dated 5 years earlier. "My dearest Clara, I am camped tonight beside a river in New South Wales, watching the stars emerge over water that reflects their light like scattered diamonds. The beauty of it stops my breath, but also breaks my heart because I have no one to share it with, no one who would understand why such moments matter. I think of you constantly, not just as a woman I once loved, but as the person who taught me to see beauty in harsh places, to find meaning in solitude, to believe that love can endure even when hope seems foolish. I wonder if you still live on our land, if you still watch the sunrise from the kitchen window, if you still talk to the sheep when you think no one is listening. I wonder if you remember the sound of my voice reading poetry aloud on quiet evenings. I wonder if you could ever forgive me for leaving, for staying away so long, for choosing what I thought was protection over what I now understand was abandonment. Most of all, I wonder if love like ours dies when it is not tended, or if it survives like the desert flowers that bloom only after rare rains but keep their seeds alive through years of drought. Clara looked up to find Philip watching her with anxious eyes, waiting for a reaction to his most private thoughts. "You did remember," she said softly. "You did still love me." "Never stopped?" he confirmed. "Never even came close to stopping." As darkness settled completely around them and Clara lit the lamp that would guide them through their first full evening together in more than 2 decades, she realized that the real conversation was just beginning. The letters had been preparation, practice of the vulnerability required to love someone in the present rather than the past, to choose each other as they were now rather than as they had been in memory. But for tonight, it was enough to sit together in companionable silence, each reading the other's words, each discovering that love can indeed survive years of drought and bloom again when conditions finally permit. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose each other. Tonight, there were simply 2 people who had found their way back to each other across an impossible distance, carrying proof that some connections are too essential to be severed by time or circumstance, or the simple human capacity for making mistakes. The wind that had once carried Clara's unspoken words into emptiness now carried the sound of 2 voices reading aloud to each other, filling the vast silence of the Outback with the conversation they had been waiting 22 years to have. Chapter 4. The Choice to Stay. 3 days had passed since Philip's arrival. 3 days of careful conversations and shared silences, of letters read aloud and stories finally told. Clara had begun to allow herself the dangerous luxury of hope, but she had also noticed the way Philip's eyes sometimes drifted to the horizon, the way he kept his few possessions neatly packed as if ready for immediate departure. On the morning of the fourth day, Clara woke to find Philip already up and moving around Alinta, his movements purposeful in a way that made her stomach clench with premonition. She had seen this kind of activity before in the travelers who passed through her homestead, the quiet efficiency of someone preparing to leave. She found him checking his horse's shoes and adjusting the saddle straps, his traveling pack already secured behind the cantle. The sight hit her like a physical blow, all the more devastating because she had begun to believe he might stay. "You're leaving," she said, not quite a question. Philip looked up from his preparations, and Clara saw conflict warring in his eyes. "I think it might be best," he said carefully. "These few days have been more than I had any right to hope for, but I don't want to complicate your life any further." "Complicate my life?" Clara felt anger rising in her chest, sharp and clean after days of careful politeness. "Philip, you've been here 3 days. In 3 days, you've helped me repair a month's worth of damage to the fence line, reorganize my band in a way that makes everything more efficient, and reminded me what it feels like to have someone to talk to at the end of the day. How exactly is it complicating my life?" "Because I don't know if I can stay," Philip replied, his voice strained. "Because 22 years of running doesn't just disappear overnight. Because I'm afraid that if I stay, if I let myself believe this could work, I'll end up hurting you again when the restlessness comes back, when I remember that I'm better at leaving than staying." Clara stared at him, recognizing the fear beneath his words, but also the self-defeating logic that had kept them apart for far too long. "So you're going to leave preemptively," she said, "to protect me from the possibility that you might leave later." When stated so plainly, the flaw in his reasoning was obvious, but Clara could see that Philip was trapped by it nonetheless. 22 years of believing himself incapable of commitment, of defining himself as a man who couldn't stay in one place, had created a prison he was struggling to escape. "I'm 55 years old, Clara," Philip said quietly. "I've spent more than half my adult life running from one thing or another. I don't know if I remember how to stay in one place, how to build something lasting. I don't know if I can be what you need." Clara felt something crystallize inside her, a clarity that came from finally understanding what was at stake. This was the moment that would determine everything, not just whether Philip stayed or left, but whether they would have the courage to choose love over fear, hope over the safety of familiar pain. "What I need," Clara said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest, "is not a perfect man who has never made mistakes. What I need is not someone who has never been broken or frightened or unsure of himself. What I need is someone who is willing to try, someone who chooses to stay not because it's easy but because it matters." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the silver threads in his hair, the uncertainty in his eyes, the way his hands had stilled on the saddle leather. "I've spent 22 years learning to be complete on my own," she continued. "I don't need you to rescue me or save me or fix the parts of my life that feel empty. But I want you here, Philip. I want to share my mornings with someone who understands why I talk to the sheep, who can read the weather signs and knows when to worry about the water level in the well. I want to cook for two again, to have someone to read with in the evenings, to fall asleep knowing I'm not the only human being for miles in any direction." Philip's hands had fallen away from his saddle completely now, and Clara could see the wall between hope and fear playing out across his features. "What if I disappoint you?" he asked quietly. "What if I'm too damaged by all these years to be a good partner? What if the habits of solitude are too strong to break?" "Then we'll figure it out together," Clara replied. "Philip, I'm not asking you for promises about forever. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm asking you to give us a chance to discover who we might be together now, as the people we become." She reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the saddle, feeling the calluses and scars that mapped his years of wandering. "I have a proposition for you," she said. "Stay through harvest season. Help me with the work. Let me show you everything I built here. Give us time to see if this feeling between us is real or just nostalgia dressed up as hope. If at the end of harvest you still feel like you need to leave, I won't try to stop you. But give us that much time. Give us a real chance." Philip was quiet for a long time, staring out at the horizon that had called to him for so many years. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I'm afraid, he admitted. I'm afraid of wanting this too much, of forgetting that good things don't last for men like me. Good things don't last for anyone, Clara said gently. That's not a reason to refuse them when they are offered. That's a reason to treasure them while they are here. She could see him wavering, caught between the ingrained habits of flight and the possibility of something he had never allowed himself to believe he deserved. There's something else, Clara said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Something I want to show you. She led him away from the horse, away from the packed belongings and the implied departure, toward the small cemetery plot behind her house where 3 wooden crosses marked the only grave for miles. I told you I'd learn to be complete on my own, Clara said as they stood before the simple markers. But I didn't tell you the cost of that learning. She gestured to the first cross, weathered by years of sun and wind but still clearly marked with a name and dates. Sarah Mitchell, Clara said quietly. She was traveling with her husband and 2 children, heading west to take up land grants. They stopped here during a bad storm, and Sarah went into labor 2 months early. I helped deliver the baby, but neither of them survived. Her husband was so broken by grief that he could barely function. I helped bury them both, and he left the children with me while he rode to the nearest town to arrange for them to go back to relatives in Adelaide. She moved to the second cross. Little Tom Mitchell, age 4, died of fever 3 weeks after his mother and baby sister. I nursed him as best I could, but I didn't have the medicines he needed, and by the time his father returned with a doctor, it was too late. The third cross bore a woman's name and dates that showed a life cut short in middle age. Mary O'Brien, Clara continued. She was traveling alone, trying to reach a brother in Perth. She arrived here half dead from thirst and exhaustion, and I nursed her back to health over the course of 2 months. She had consumption, though we didn't know it at first. She died during what would have been our second winter together. Clara turned to face Philip, her eyes bright with unshed tears but her voice steady. I buried 3 people in the 22 years you've been gone, she said. I've held dying children, closed the eyes of women who became friends, stood alone in this vastness and wondered if caring about people only leads to heartbreak. I've learned that love doesn't guarantee permanence, that opening your heart to someone means accepting the possibility of losing them. She reached out and took both of his hands in hers, feeling the warmth of his skin, the solid reality of his presence. But I've also learned that the alternative, protecting yourself from loss by refusing to love, isn't protection at all. It's just another kind of death, slower but just as certain. I'd rather have 6 months of sharing my life with you than spend the rest of my years wondering what might have been if I'd had the courage to try. Philip stayed down at their joined hands, and Clara could see tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "You asking me to choose hope over fear," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to choose love over safety," Clara corrected. "I'm asking you to believe that some things are worth the risk of pain, that some connections are strong enough to survive uncertainty." For a long moment they stood in silence, surrounded by the markers of loss but also by the endless sky that had witnessed both death and life, endings and beginnings. The full cycle of human experience played out under its vast expanse. Finally, Philip squeezed Clara's hands and looked directly into her eyes. "Harvest season," he said. "I'll stay through harvest season." Clara felt something tight in her chest finally release, like a breath she had been holding for 22 years. "Harvest season," she agreed. They walked back to his horse together, and Clara watched as Philip unpacked his traveling gear with the same deliberate care he had used to prepare it. But this time, instead of preparing to leave, he was preparing to stay. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Clara brought out writing materials and placed them on the small table between their chairs. "I have one more letter to write," she said. "But this one I'd like to write with you." Philip looked puzzled but curious as Clara dipped a pen in ink and began to write at the top of the page, "To whom it may concern." "It's a letter to the Postal Service," Clara explained as she wrote, "requesting that they add a regular mail delivery route to this area. I've been thinking about it for years, but I never had a good enough reason to justify the expense and effort it would require to convince them." She looked at Philip with a smile that carried 22 years of hope finally allowed full expression. "Now I do," If we are going to build a life together, even just for one harvest season, we are going to need better connections to the outside world. And I want to be able to receive letters as well as write them. Philip picked up a second pen and added his signature to the bottom of the letter when Clara had finished, his handwriting slightly shaky with emotion. "Our first letter sent together," he said quietly. "The first of many, I hope," Clara replied. As they sealed the envelope and prepared it for posting, Clara realized that this simple act represented everything she had learned about love during their long separation. Love wasn't just about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about the daily choice to build something together, to plan for a shared future even when that future was uncertain. In the wide, red silence of the Outback, love often returns not with grand declarations, but with a hand held in silence or a letter finally posted. If Clara and Philip's journey touched your heart, consider subscribing for more stories of healing and second chances. And tell us in the comments, what letter have you never sent, but still carry inside you? The harvest season stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and challenge, work to be shared and conversations to be had. Whether it would lead to a lifetime together or simply provide closure for love that had never been properly resolved remained to be seen. But for the first time in 22 years, Clara fell asleep knowing that tomorrow would bring the continuation of a conversation rather than another day of solitary monologue. Outside, the wind that had once carried her unspoken words and emptiness now whispered around a homestead that sheltered two hearts brave enough to try again. Two people who had learned that love's greatest victory is not in lasting forever, but in having the courage to begin again when given a second chance. The letters were finally being answered. The conversation was finally complete. And in the vast Australian outback, where distances are measured not just in miles but in the spaces between human hearts, two people had found their way back to each other across the greatest distance of all, the years that separate who we were from who we might yet become.